questions and integrating those when possible, as well as providing additional resources. So please use the chat as much as you can. And you also have some information on how to stay in touch with us and learn about upcoming programs at the bottom of the reminders card. I hope that you all will join me. Those of you in the US, in any event in particular, in following, there we go, there's the House Rules card that I was speaking about a moment ago. Please join me in following the example of institutions across Australia and Canada and a growing number in the United States in acknowledging, particularly in the United States, that we are located on unceded Indigenous lands and territories, and in honoring the leaders, past, present, and emergent, of those communities, and in paying our respects to them. This is a developing practice for us, as it is for a number of institutions in the United States, and you'll find some resources associated with it and some background on it in the resources document that you'll see posted in the chat and that you'll receive after today's event. We think it's a really important practice. It's becoming a developing norm. I'd also like to ask you to join me in welcoming our really incredible guests today. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
First, Shahzeen Attari, who's a behavioral scientist at the University of Indiana. Mary Annaïse Heglar, who's a public intellectual who has changed the conversation on climate, race, and emotions. Rabbi Jennie Rosenn, who founded and who leads the organization Dayenu, and a very special guest, who those of us at the Climate Museum were lucky enough to meet in our very first youth climate arts program, Otaniyuwa Ehue, who is, among many other things, a gifted poet and a sophomore at Howard University. Thank you all so much for being here with us. I want to say two things quickly about our subject today. Many of you are here because you feel overwhelmed by your emotions about the climate crisis. And first off, that just makes sense. There was a study that came out 2 days ago about how in 2018, 8.7 million people died because of fossil fuels being burned. In the climate community, we often enough talk about how humans didn't evolve to respond adequately to risks that are global. We respond to the lion walking into the room, not to the really concerning sign of the climate crisis on the other side of the world. It's just not how we're wired. It's not how we evolved. And I've been thinking as this panel has been approaching how the same is true for emotions. We evolved to grieve within small communities. We evolved to grieve locally. And now we have to grieve globally for all of the injustices that the climate crisis wreaks, for all of the harms that it imposes on us. And that's just hard. So if you find yourself overwhelmed, first, as today attests, you're not alone. And that's how we can move forward together. And second, there's no other way that we could feel, really. There's nothing in our history as a species that prepares us to know about all of these grievous things that are happening. And then the second thing is an encouragement to notice your own emotions, including grief, and to see them as a space of possibility. And on grief in particular, when we're mourning what we've already lost and what we're likely to lose, part of what that means is what there is left to fight for, which is everything, which is so precious. And so we want to encourage the transition from an embrace of our feelings into action collectively in our discussion today. And to start us off in doing that, it's just a joy to reintroduce you to Ota, who's going to perform for us a poem about the climate crisis entitled Carly. Hello again, Ota, and thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Of course. Hey everyone, this poem is entitled Carlise. One day, I'm going to have a daughter. Her name will be Carlise, and she will be the most beautiful thing I've ever laid eyes on. Her name will be Carlise, and her nickname will be Cara. In Cornish, her name would mean love, and that's all I would give to her. From the moment I first hold her, I would give her all the love I could muster, remind her every day of just what her name means. Now I know, it's strange I already have her name picked out. I'm only 20 and I should be worried about college, not baby names. I should figure out my wife's name before I start thinking about my child's. But I have to think about this baby I'm going to cling so desperately to. Because the rest of the world refuses to. I see myself holding my baby named Love, and I see her first breaths being contaminated with plastic. I see her first tears to signal her first breath, and they're coming out in streams of oil. I hear her first laugh, and it sounds like the sounds of car horns and stone cold capitalists concerned about efficiency over morality. I see her first steps, and they're through mounds of litter she has to stumble through. I see her with a little bit more pigmentation than others. I see her subjected to the same systems that work disproportionately against people that look like her. People who aren't able to run away from the destruction of their environments. People who are forced to contend with the issues that those who continuously forsake our planet ignore. People who are the first to be hit by a disaster but the last to be saved. People trapped in self-deprecating cycles because they lack the resources to change them, and so they continue to play into them. Systems that value success and profit over lives because caring about others isn't baked into our curriculum, so now green can only be seen in cash. Trees standing tall while we're clipping them down. Innovators stand up. I see the futures, our sons and daughters running through muck. Imagine looking in their eyes, knowing you didn't do enough. Imagine hearing them cry because a wildfire from lack of rain woke them up. I imagine Carlise. I see my baby. I imagine love being choked and suffocated under clouds of smoke. Love drowned by heightened waves caused by melted ice because those charged with making change today have remained frozen. Love forced to stand her ground against a tide that has been aimed directly at her from the moment her heart beats. Love persecuted, forsaken at the hands of prejudice, injustice, inaction. I see a world that love can't live in. A world that Kara can't live in. Maybe I won't have a daughter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ota. That is a beautiful way for us to begin. Now, if we could welcome the panelists back again. And while we're doing that, I was remiss earlier in not shouting out and thanking our incredible ASL interpreter, who we've worked with a number of times now, Andrea Lust, whose work is just beautiful to watch. I was warning the panelists before, don't look at her or you'll get mesmerized. So you in the audience can decide where you want to put your attention. I'm going to start with a question for you, Mary, which I'll ask to everyone in turn, which is just to tell us about your climate origin story. How did you become a climate person, a climate protagonist, and how do you see climate questions as bound up with questions of inequality?
Yeah, so I became interested in working on climate change. Like I decided I was going to dedicate my life to it about in 2014. I have always worked in, a mission-driven space, and always in nonprofits and communications. And in that year, 2014, I was working at a social science research foundation. And that work is important and it's great, but it takes a really long time to build a body of evidence to actually make a difference. It takes like decades. And I felt like I was watching the world fall apart in real time. So I decided when I was leaving that I wanted to work on something more immediate. I wanted to work on something where I felt like I was making an immediate impact. And so I decided that was either climate change or public health. And so I actively sought out getting into the climate space, and it sort of snowballed from there. And how do I see the climate question intertwined with injustice? I think all climate questions are a question of injustice. The climate crisis is just one giant injustice.
Yes, that's our view at the Climate Museum as well. Thank you for that. Let me pose that question to you, Jennie. What's your climate origin story, and how do you see climate and injustice as connecting?
Well, I'll just start by saying it's wonderful to be here, and I'm so glad that we're having this conversation about grief, the climate, and inequality. I grew up in a family where part of what it meant to be Jewish was to be engaged in the world and working for social justice. And I became a rabbi and worked for 2 decades, really mobilizing the American Jewish community to address issues of social and economic justice. And I was always much more oriented towards issues that I saw as impacting people, human rights, issues of social, economic, racial justice. I think like many people, I saw the environment as this thing out there, and I was somehow less viscerally connected to it. And that really started to change for me a handful of years ago. I think there were a bunch of things that contributed to that awakening. I remember reading reports, the IPCC report, and realizing this is coming so much faster and more furiously than I certainly had realized. I had a kind of like, where the hell have I been moment. People have been talking about this for years. How did I not get it? And at the time, I was working with refugees. And hearing their stories and witnessing their pain and imagining that we could have 1 billion climate refugees if we don't make massive change. And that's just an unfathomable number. And I came to really realize, again, in one of these like, where have I been moments, that the climate crisis is at its core an issue of social, economic, and racial justice, just as Mary was saying. It's about who's going to bear the brunt of climate change, who already is bearing the brunt of climate change, and who's going to be most severely impacted. And I think of it as it's almost like a disparity multiplier, right? It affects everyone, but not everyone equally. And the climate crisis, as we know, rests disproportionately on those who've been historically marginalized. People living in the global south in poverty, particularly vulnerable areas, people who are already experiencing racism and bigotry. So I was having conversations at the same time with family and friends about how the Jewish community wasn't showing up sort of in all of our people in power to confront this moment. I was not looking to start a new organization in my early 50s. I know that startups are not for the faint of heart. And I also felt like we are living in a time when we all need to do uncomfortable things. And what is at stake is nothing less than the future of humanity. And so I founded Dayenu, a Jewish organization that's working together with other communities to confront the climate crisis. We like to say with spiritual audacity and bold political action.
Thank you for that. One day after the pandemic, when we're on the other side of the pandemic tunnel, we can get together and talk among other things about the midlife startup experience.
I look forward to that.
Yeah, me too. Totally appreciate that, Jennie. And Shahzeen, how about you? What's your climate origin story, and how do you see climate and inequality intersecting?
Sure. So I grew up in the Middle East, in Dubai, which is part of the United Arab Emirates. And while I was growing up there, the entire country sort of went from a desert to a metropolis. and it's very consumer oriented. So there was something at the back of my mind that was always sort of thinking about how we always thinking about our really challenging relationship with the natural world. And then I came to the United States to study physics and math and then engineering. And the year that I started my PhD was 2004. And that's the year that this wonderful paper in Science magazine came out saying, all right, we already have the solutions for climate change. We kind of just need the political will and the public, the political and public will in order to act. And so since then, I've sort of taken my engineering background and completely switched and started working on how we think about the problem of climate change, our perceptions of energy, our perceptions of water systems, where we think we can make the biggest difference, the way we think about the future and how to make the future feel more visceral to people today. So that's sort of why I work primarily as a scientist in this field. In terms of how I've come to the climate justice movement is I think after sort of becoming more aware of a lot of the problems that we face today, I think it's really hard for scientists to sort of sit at the sidelines and just do science, as what Mary was saying. And so my call to action is really trying to figure out solutions that involve multi-stakeholders. And so that's sort of my climate story, is just this call to action that's sort of embedded in being a pretty hardcore nerd scientist.
That's fantastic. There's an all hands on deck call that all of you are making, which again, we totally agree with at the Climate Museum. And I also want you specifically to know, Shahzeen, that the other day, one of our colleagues performed calculus as part of a grant application. So I hope that gets us some cred with you. I was only spectating, but it was fun. Those origin stories are rich and helpful context and much appreciated. Mary, I have a question for you specifically now. You've written so powerfully about your own climate grief. Can you tell us about how you see climate emotions as fitting into the fight for a better future?
Yeah, I think that if we are going to really engage with climate change and really try to open the doors for other people to be involved in it, we have to talk about it as an emotional subject. Human beings are emotional animals. And so if I were a doctor coming to you and telling you that you had this rare, quite possibly deadly disease, and I only told you the lens of how it's attacking your body, and how, if I described this disease and how it was attacking your body as though you don't live in your body, you would probably say that at bedside manner, and you wouldn't come back to me as a doctor, and you might just even give up on your life. Whereas if you have a doctor that acknowledges how this might make you feel, how it might affect your life as a human being, you're far more likely to engage with it, and you're far more likely to go back to that doctor. So if we are going to bring more people into climate, we need to talk about the fact that this is scary. It is terrifying. It's sad. It's enraging. And all of those emotions have a place in this. We can't be stoic about it. This is our home. These are the places that made us, that are burning and drowning. And there's no way to look at that and not feel something. So yeah, it's a critical part of the conversation. We're not talking about the emotions of climate change. We're not talking about climate change.
Agreed. And thank you. Shahzeen, I'd like to talk to you about the toggle back and forth between the collective and the individual in your work. Your work addresses both individual perception of climate action and collective behavioral changes. Can you talk about how those work together in your mind?
Sure. So individuals are part of the collective, and we have to start empowering people so that climate change is not some problem that just happens in the future, but it's something that we have collective power over. I also come from Indiana University, which is the home of Elinor Ostrom, one of the first women to ever win a Nobel Prize in economics. And her work actually shows that people together, especially in small groups, can govern our commons. So there's a lot of hope in that research as well. And so some of my work looks at the types of narratives that we tell ourselves about how to solve this problem and who's responsible to solve this problem. And so I think individuals need to be empowered. In general, a lot of people feel like, all right, it's such a huge problem, I really don't know what to do about it. So we need to empower people and then give people a pathway as to what they can do in order to make concrete changes, both in their lives and in the political system, in order to move forward and mitigate and adapt to climate change today.
Super helpful. And just correct me where I'm wrong here, but to make sure that we take account of people who might not be familiar with Ostrom's work. As I understand it, was previously a background perception that posited the idea that whenever there's a commons, whenever there are shared resources, there's an inevitable, quote, tragedy of the commons, close quote, where people will overutilize and despoil what's not personally theirs. And what Ostrom shows is that where there's communication and lowercase d democratic decision making and collaboration, that's not the case. That's not the case at all. That's definitely very condensed. Is there anything fundamentally wrong with that you want to correct for the audience?
No, that was a great summary.
Okay, great. And that, of course, gives us hope for building a collective movement that can advance us all toward the climate justice that we're talking about. Jennie, I want to ask you about your response to Ota's poem and the questions that it raises about how the climate crisis is being experienced differently by people of different ages and different generations. How do you at Dayenu see that showing up in your work?
First of all, Ota's poem is so powerful. I just really want to say that in the way that it addresses the grief at a future loss. There's probably a German word for that, but I don't know what it is. I think it's so important to bring in the generational dimension because the futures and past that people are mourning are not identical. They're different across lines of race and class and geography, and also generation. And there's always a risk at generalizing, so I'll just say that as a disclaimer. But what we're seeing is that there are responses that can be kind of aligned with generations. So those who are living in the latter third of their lives, boomers, and I guess the greatest generation, as they call it, I think are experiencing more feelings of sadness and guilt about what they're leaving to the next generation. They're aware that they're not going to be here to bear the worst of what's ahead. And for millennials and Gen Z kids, this is all they've ever known. And many are really angry. Some feel hopeless, even a sense of nihilism. But this is also the generation that's leading the way with such a clear voice and such powerful mobilization, really calling older generations to account, calling us to action. And Gen X, for many, the world's not as we thought it was. The narrative that many of us grew up with, that you work and things will keep getting better, turned out to be completely wrong. So I think in addition to worrying about our children and grandchildren and future generations, many of us are also mourning the world as we knew it or as we thought it was. And again, this is sort of anecdotal. This is not, as Shaz does, academic research. It's really from faith communities mobilizing people. And I'll just sort of end by saying I think that there are real differences and everyone is experiencing a whole panoply of emotions and asking a few basic questions. How do we live during this time? How do we face the truth? What's going to happen? And what can I do? What can I possibly do? And I think, as Shaz was saying, figuring out how we're building pathways for people to take actions that contribute the gifts of every generation and that also honor those differences.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to stick with you for a moment, Jennie, and ask you a question that Mary and Shaz, I'll then ask you guys. which has to do with another powerful, unpleasant emotion. Because unfortunately, grief does not have a monopoly on powerful and unpleasant climate emotions. There's a whole slew of them, as we've already been referencing today. And I want to talk in particular about the sense of complicity in shame that I believe we're conditioned and encouraged, and in some ways culturally bullied into having for the climate crisis. And to ask you all about your approach to refusing shame in order to, I think that's one of the main reasons that, there are a lot of main reasons. There are many reasons why people turn away from climate action. I think one thing is that sense of shame and complicity. How do you personally, and or how do you encourage your constituents and members to refuse shame in order to move forward together on the climate crisis?
So I think the first step is, I think, to make space for the emotions. As Mary was speaking about, there is such a dynamic piece of confronting the climate crisis that is emotional. And I think they're mostly uncomfortable feelings. And so I think we often kind of close ourselves off from them. So part of it is acknowledging the feelings. I also think that we are then in response doing things that are not commensurate with the problem, and feel guilty, like we should be doing more. And also feel like that doing more will somehow interfere with our lifestyle and comfort. And then we feel more guilt and shame about that. So like for me, that's like my constant battle with the air conditioner every summer. I have like a crisis of conscience. And that shame is tied up with this thought that we're not doing enough. And we encounter that feeling multiple times a day. But the kicker is that those individual actions are not what's going to get us where we need to go to avoid the most devastating impacts of the climate crisis, right? We need to not just focus on like, what car do I buy, but like, what cars is Detroit manufacturing? And not just like, where do I bank, but what are the biggest banks that are investing in fossil fuel? And how do we take action against them? And I'll just say parenthetically, I think the fossil fuel companies want us to focus on individual habits and stop there. They don't want us believing that big change is possible. So I don't want to dismiss personal actions, but if we all lowered our carbon footprint, we would not avert the most devastating impacts of the climate crisis. So part of the response, I think, to shame is giving people meaningful ways to take action at the scale that science and justice demand. That collective action, moving past just like averting our eyes, moving past the shame, taking in the truth, but then moving towards collective, empowered, bold action that's commensurate with the crisis.
Profoundly helpful observations, and really in line with approach to inspiring action that we try to take at the Climate Museum. Something that many people we've found don't know is that the whole phrase carbon footprint was invented by BP in order to make us feel guilty. It's a PR scam. And Mary, this is an area where you've done a ton of really important work. Can you share some of your insights on how to combat shame in order to move toward action?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think that the way we think of individual action is a bit problematic because we often think of individual action as specifically consumer action. And I think it's much bigger than that. I think that we are more than consumers. As you were saying, the carbon footprint idea was developed by BP. And of course, BP defined individual action and carbon footprint based on what you buy and what you use, because that's all we are to them is consumers. So if we start thinking of individual action in terms of what we do as citizens, as well as what we do as consumers and what we do as family members and what we do as friends, like that expands a whole new world of climate action, right? And so us being on this panel today is an individual action. The people who decide to come and watch us, that's an individual action. All of my decision to write essays is a personal action, right? So like it just becomes so much bigger and so much more limitless. I also would just like to say that I think that Guilt actually can be useful. Shame is not useful. So guilt is basically, I did a bad thing, and you can stop doing that bad thing. Shame is, I am a bad person. And that is like really isolating and shuts people down, and it's just not useful at all. But if you feel guilty about the environment, you can change your actions, you can do something different to alleviate that guilt. Also, I mean, if you are feeling shame around the environment, like investigate where that shame is coming from, but also know that shame cannot thrive in community. So probably the reason why you're feeling bogged down by shame is because you feel like you're the only one living this life. You're the only one dealing with this problem, and you're not. So get out and find the community that you need to kill that shame. Lastly, I'll just say that climate grief is a syndrome. It's not like a one type of emotion. It's not just sadness. It's not just, despair. Climate grief includes things like bargaining. It includes things like guilt. It includes anger. It includes despair. It includes all sorts of things. It's a syndrome. It's not like stagnant. So some days you're going to feel great. Some days you're going to feel like you can't do anything. Some days you are going to be furious. And all of that is valid. And it means that you're a human being who's feeling things.
Thank you for that. Shaz, any thoughts on shame and complicity and moving past them to take meaningful action?
So I just loved what Jennie and Mary just said. It's sort of like the spirit, the emotion, and now I'm sort of going to talk a little bit about the brain. We've actually studied the power of ad hominem attacks in our lab. An ad hominem attack is sort of an attack to the person as opposed to an attack to the argument. And what we find is that these types of attacks can be really powerful, and they should be sort of nipped in the bud. So when you're talking about climate change and climate action, I would highly recommend starting off with what you are doing as a person in your life, in your community, in order to say, hey, this is what I'm doing, this is how I'm trying. But to live means that we will emit carbon dioxide. From my very breath, like just breathing out, just exhaling, releases a CO2 into the atmosphere. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is not, again, going back to power and the power dynamic that we face, is to sort of regain that power for ourselves as opposed to allowing other people to sort of take our power away from us. And I think one of the things that sort of we look at in our research is it is really powerful to sort of to talk about the things that we're doing, and you actually don't have to be an extreme climate sort of a superstar and sort of do everything from composting your own human waste to like being vegetarian and sort of not having children in order to be an effective climate communicator. Just sort of trying your very best is enough in order to sort of start the conversation. And I think that's a pretty powerful message that we have found in our work. But I would love to sort of stitch in both the spiritual component and the human feeling component into that. And sort of the other part that I'd like to mention is that as a researcher studying this, sometimes the grief can be pretty challenging to deal with because, no matter how long you study this, no one particular researcher alone can solve this problem. So we need collective action, and we need to have these collective conversations of how to move forward.
Collective action emerging unsurprisingly as a major theme in the conversation. Shahzeen, I want to stay with you to ask about the last 12 months, and then Mary and Jennie, I'll have this question for you guys as well. As Mary was just pointing out, we have welters of different emotions at different times, and sometimes at the same time. In the last 12 months, we've had the pandemic, we've had the election and its aftermath, we've had elevated attention to police murders and the Black Lives Matter movement. Do you feel that we're better equipped or worse equipped emotionally now to move forward in this moment of potential promise on climate than we were 12 months ago?
That's a great question, and I'll answer as a person as opposed to my researcher hat. And I feel really emotionally raw. Like I feel exhausted. I feel full of. I feel tired a lot. I sometimes have trouble sleeping. I grind my teeth at night. And all of these are still like under a new administration because I think a lot of what's happened in the past 12 months has sort of peeled away the veil of ignorance from a lot of people. And a lot of us actually knew that this is what America is, and this is who we are. And so trying to move forward is really important, but it's also really challenging because how do you have these types of conversations with people who are really different, who might be really different from you? And so I think that I think for many people it is a wake up call as to where we are and the types of challenges we need to act on. But I think sort of coming back from to the academic community, I think it's also a wake up call to see how interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary some of these challenges are. So it's no longer time to say, hey, you know, just a price on carbon is enough in order to deal with a lot of the climate problems that we're facing. We really need to contend with racial discrimination, with justice issues, with intergenerational issues, so on and so forth. And so I think, at least for me, it's been both challenging and sort of difficult, but I also think it's been sort of a huge wake up call for our community.
It's hard to know whether the total interpenetration of climate and inequality as crises would be as much of a commonplace now if we hadn't gone through what we've all gone through in the last 12 months. I totally agree. Mary, your thoughts, better or worse situated to move forward now?
Both, because the crisis has just like sort of spiraled, but also the pathway for action is better than it was. However, you know, we keep saying that Biden has the most aggressive climate plan in history, but he's now facing, you know, that's actually a really low bar. And the crisis has gotten so much worse than all of those previous plans before. I mean, it wasn't until very recently that a presidential candidate was expected to even have a climate plan. So that's not exactly reassuring to me. So I think it's better, and I think it's also worse, but I'm excited that more people are involved in it and see themselves in it, and that climate denial is on the decline.
Right. It's also the case that while we can see promise taking shape on the horizon in a meaningful way, nothing has happened yet in the new administration, and that's not even a critique. It's just less than a month old. So the appointments and the conception that appears to be very committed are definitely better than anything we've seen before by a huge margin, but we are way behind, as you point out, and that's a hard thing to sit with. Jennie, your thoughts on where the last 12 months leave us in relation to moving forward?
I think it depends what we do with it, right? Like the disruption that's been caused has given us a whole set of experiences that we didn't have 12 months ago. We understand in a new way how interconnected we are. We have experienced what disruption feels like, what happens when governments completely fail to prepare or adequately respond, what happens when we don't listen to science, right? We've all lived that experience, and I think are aware of just how fragile our systems are. And the economic fallout has given us this opportunity to re-envision and rebuild, right? Not to bolster the same unjust economies and polluting infrastructure, but to actually rebuild differently. And I also think that the uprisings for Black lives have put into sharper relief for many people the systemic racism that just pulses through our nation and the insidiousness of white supremacy. And I think it's given people, I've noticed that people who didn't quite understand before what do you mean climate doesn't affect everyone equally? What is this climate justice thing? I think people have a reference point in COVID now, wherein it affects everyone, but not equally. It's the disproportionate impacts. And at the same time, as Shaz said, people are overwhelmed. I had a friend say to me the other day, you want me to worry about something else? Like, I can't. There's too much. So I think the challenge for us all as sort of climate leaders and activists and organizers and communicators is to help people make the connection between these experiences over the past year and the climate crisis, right? Both the climate collapse is going to be so much worse than what we're experiencing now. Some people call it a fire drill or a dress rehearsal. It's so much bigger and badder, worse. And we've also had this experience where we've made changes that were unimaginable. Like if someone had told us a year ago, your kids are going to go to school in their bedrooms, no one's going to travel anywhere, a lot of people are going to work from home, people are going to walk around in masks, like you would have said, what are you talking about? So we've had this like massive communal change. And the question is, how do we in this moment take those experiences and channel them for the kind of communal, transformational, bold change that's needed in this moment?
Absolutely. With, as you have all said, white supremacy now front and center in all of that, and not avoidable. It's a part of business as usual. That's been the deep structure of American business as usual. That's now, it's just not possible to keep it sidelined in the way that it has been in the past. Jennie, let me stay with you for a moment and ask you specifically about the role of faith organizations in confronting the climate crisis with collective action. The one of the great strengths of faith organizations is that many of them, and this is true of museums too, enjoy a really high degree of public trust. What's your perspective on the role of Dayenu and other faith organizations in helping people metabolize the syndrome, as Mary put it, of climate grief, the series of difficult emotions, in order to make progress together?
So I think one of the roles of faith communities is giving people sort of space and support to, as metabolize feels like the right word, to really sit with all of those experiences and big questions and emotions. I think so often we sort of turn away or disassociate, or we distract ourselves with the busyness of our lives and our to-do lists and our families and Netflix. It's like, it's too much for our souls to bear what is happening and what could happen as we march towards more and more destruction. So I think one of the roles for religious communities and institutions is to be a place for people to sit with that, and sit with that in a way that feels supported. So like at Dayenu, we're taking some of the work of Miranda Massie, who's someone who's worked a lot in this arena, and really thinking about sort of what does that mean in a Jewish context. And I know other faith communities are similarly doing that. I also think that the role of community is so important. And faith communities are one place where people do experience community. It can take a lot of different forms, but I think knowing that you are encountering this not alone, as Mary said about shame, is such an important piece of it. And finally, I think that there are a role for song and spirit and ritual and learning and sort of all the things that sustain us as human beings, and sustain our spirits in what's going to be a very long and hard process. So I think that faith communities can really, help to sustain people in that and hold out a sort of moral voice and a very clear sense of what is needed, while also supporting people to experience that. And part of how you live with that experience is by engaging in action. And I think there too, faith communities have a role.
The kind of combination of the speed, the ferocious speed with which these crises need to be tackled, and the fact that it's going to be a very long fight as well, is something that at times it's hard to wrap one's head around. We have a great question from the audience asking you all to talk about how, with the kind of sailing drip of terrible information about the climate crisis, you manage your own emotions when you find them on the verge of overwhelm. You've talked a little bit about this, Shaz, and I guess I would add we had drafted a question that to tack onto that audience question. How do you keep grief from becoming despair, from sliding into despair? Do you have advice for the people who are with us today? And I guess I'll start with you, Shaz.
That's a really great question. So what I tell my students is that imagine your plane's going down. You need to first make sure that your air mask is on your own face, on your own. You have to take care of yourself first before taking care of those around you. So what I do in my own personal life is I have a dog. I live in the woods. I go out hiking. I love art. I love sci-fi, and I love reading. So I try to make sure that every day there's a little bit of time carved out for doing something that's a little bit different from climate action, from climate activism, because sometimes it can be challenging, disheartening. So that sort of revamps my battery, and then I go back out again. And so that's kind of my strategy of dealing with some of the deeper challenges of the climate movement, but also dealing with my own emotional struggle with the need and drive for big change and big system-wide change, where we're 100% carbon neutral, and our entire infrastructure is really, really different to getting there and where we are today. So again, you have to take care of yourself in order to be sort of be very active in this space, I think.
Incredibly important advice. Mary, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I would say that the thing about climate grief that makes it unique to any other type of grief that human beings are used to feeling is that, normally the grief cycle goes from, bargaining, denial, anger, despair, finally acceptance. You can't accept this. Because one, you're still alive. The planet is still here. It's a slow burn that, depending on where you are, can be a lot faster. But accepting this means like accepting that it's over. I personally cannot do that. And so you cycle in and out of the other stages of grief all the time. So just accept that that's going to happen. And I think the original wording of the question was, how do you stop climate grief from sliding into despair? And the answer is, I don't. Sometimes I feel despair. Sometimes I feel very, very, very sad. And that's okay, because that reminds me that I haven't accepted it. I haven't given up. I'm still a human being who feels things. I'm not the person who can look at the whole world light on fire and feel okay. I don't want to be that person. It is going to feel bad sometimes. And we're going to have to be okay with feeling bad sometimes. And I don't think that that's something to necessarily dread. You want to have the full experience of human emotion, and you want to remain an empathetic person. That's way more important to me than feeling good all the time.
That's a really helpful correction and observation, and I appreciate it. Jennie, what advice do you have for our audience on, I guess, let me rephrase, on preventing grief from becoming a factor that prevents you from being able to move forward, becomes a disabling factor? How do you prevent that?
So I think it's a question of holding in one hand the urgency, and in the other hand the possibility for transformation, because both are true. And it's a different kind of toggle, if you will. We named Dayenu Dayenu because it's a song of joy that's sung at the Passover Seder, right? Telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, from slavery to freedom. And the song recounts all the things that God has done for us. If God took us out of Egypt and given us the Torah, we say Dayenu, it would have been enough. But Dayenu also means we've had enough, like enough with the destruction, enough with valuing fossil fuel companies over human life, enough with letting the climate impacts, fall disproportionately on certain populations, like Dayenu, the urgency of it. But it also means we have enough. We have what we need to confront the climate crisis and move towards climate solutions. We have the policy rubrics, we have the technology, we have the people in power. We may or may not get there. I, pray to God that we will get there and work every day. And we have what we need so that everyone can have enough. And so it's not game over yet. And so I think holding both of those things, the urgency of it and the possibility that still exists, for us to pull ourselves back from the brink and do so in a way that centers justice for all people.
That double meaning of Dayenu is so profound and beautiful. What a great name for your organization. I also have a question that may just be me projecting. I'm not sure this will resonate for you all, so feel free to decline to answer it. And it's about the flip side of the previous question in a way. It's how do we prevent resilience, which we obviously need, from turning into a kind of emotional repression? And the story I'll tell on myself about this has to do with the day that Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Accord. And a very close friend of mine called me right before bedtime to ask if I was okay. And I assured her that I was perfectly fine, that we had all seen this coming, that subnational governments were doing their thing, that we were going to just have to vote him out of office, and it was all, expected and all systems go. And then I went into the bathroom to brush my teeth. And about 30 seconds later, I was choking on toothpaste and tears and most likely some snot. And I had ran back out to the living room and got on the phone and just cried into the phone with my friend, because at least for me, sometimes the need to move forward and to do the work that we do at the Climate Museum to inspire collective action that feels meaningful to participants can sometimes make the line between resilience and repression, let's just say, being kind to me, a little permeable. And I wonder if any of you has thoughts on that and on measures to take against that.
Yeah, I'll start. I think this goes back to the cyclical nature of climate grief, because what you described to me sounds more like bargaining and denial, and then you came right back out into despair. And that's going to happen, right? So this idea of like, how do we stop any given part of climate grief? You don't. And it's not a useful exercise to judge it. It's not a useful exercise to try to figure out the right way to feel, because you're just going to feel a lot of things. Like this, climate change is a syndrome, so is climate grief. And you're going to feel different ways at different times. You're going to weaponize different feelings in different ways. And I think we need to stop trying to judge ourselves for not feeling the right way. There's no right way to feel. There's only an honest way to feel. And just be honest with yourself. Like, you went through 3 different cycles in what sounds like the space of an hour. That's fine.
Any resonance for you, Shaz or Jennie?
I can say the one thing that I've learned, at least for myself, is all of us, we wear multiple hats, and we have different parts of us that we sort of keep for ourselves and keep for others, our friends, family, colleagues, so on and so forth. And what I've realized, at least personally, is that I've opened the door to vulnerability a lot more in the past few years. I would say, and I think that's actually made me feel a lot stronger, because I've had when you do that, you realize you're not alone. And that feeling of loneliness is actually replaced with a feeling of friendship and camaraderie with others that I've found actually very powerful.
I agree with that completely. And the centrality of vulnerability, which we've been talking around this whole hour, but haven't really said out loud yet. So I really appreciate that. I feel like it's, in a sense, been an inside out gift of this terrible time following the 2016 election, and what the whole society has been going through. Jennie, any thoughts on maintaining a kind of resilience that's not repressive?
Just to echo what's been said in terms of sitting with what is real and making space for that, and that is both a deeply personal experience and a communal one, right? To have it be true to yourself and in community simultaneously.
Well, thank you all for that and for all of this. I'd like to ask that you all stay up here with me as I make a set of asks of our audience that relate to the need to take action together as a community, which is part of how we've come together today, even though we're in different places. And there are some senses in which it would be a lot better to be together, though we have people from further flung locations to whom we can be accessible because of being online. We're a community of action today. And there are 3 action asks that the 4 of us are making of you together. The first is to have a conversation, or more than one conversation, about this panel with someone in your life in the next couple of days. That's the easiest of the asks, and one that you can repeat many, many times, and we hope that you will. We hope that we've provided you with space to think about your own climate emotions and how they can, how metabolizing them, to use that word again, can help you move forward. The second is to call your elected representatives, in particular your 3 members of Congress, and to let them know how much the climate crisis writ large, and understood to encompass all the other crises we've been talking about, matters to you, and that it changes your vote. And in particular, you can ask them to take the No Fossil Fuel Money pledge, or thank them if they've already done so. And that's a very easy thing to Google. Legislators count your calls, and they assume that everybody who picks up the phone represents hundreds of constituents who feel the same way and will vote the same way, but who are not taking the time, making the effort, feeling confident enough to pick up the phone. But if you do that today, if you've never done it before, it can feel intimidating at first. But after you do it once, you will, I believe, feel a real sense of satisfaction, and your call will be written down and counted, and it will matter, and it can help move us forward in the months to come toward the rapid gains that we've been talking about and that we need. And then the third suggestion is to explore joining a climate-focused organization, and making that work a part of your life going forward in an integrated way, starting with just attending a meeting or another event like this one. So with those asks, I want to thank all of you so much again for joining us today. Huge thanks to you, Shaz and Mary and Jennie and Ota and Andrea. It's been fantastic to explore these questions with you. They're so difficult, and so much what is in front of us. And we really, really appreciate your time. And to everybody who's here out in the audience, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And please use this as an opportunity to think about your own capacity to make a difference on this absolutely critical question for for our species, for our civilization, for all of us, for each and all of us. I want to warmly invite you to our next Second Fridays event, which is March 12th at 1 p.m. And there we'll be exploring the theme of infrastructure in relation to climate and inequality. And with that, bid you all a very, very fond farewell. Thank you for being here today.